You know, we love to encourage one another to be thankful. But most of the time, our human gratitude only goes up to a point. We thank God for our health until we lose it. We thank God for our money until we don't have any. We thank God for our job until we're fired. We thank God for our home until it becomes a war zone. We all have times in our life when it is difficult to show gratitude. And sometimes it's even difficult to be around thankful people. And in those times, we feel some tension when we read a verse like, "And give thanks for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ." Give thanks for everything. Everything. We like to say to the Apostle Paul, who wrote those words, "What were you thinking?" That's easy for you to say. And then we learn that he wrote those words in a Roman prison facing death. So we kind of get quiet again. How could he always have an attitude of gratitude in his heart? How could he be thankful for everything while he's sitting in an awful prison cell? And how can you? Because that's the question that is of importance today, not how he did it, how we do it. And one of the answers, I think, is found in Psalm 97. The author of this psalm is absolutely awed by the greatness of God. He's astounded by what God is and who he is. And we're going to learn from reading this psalm today and studying it that it's possible to be thankful to God anytime, everywhere, when we focus on who he is and what he does and not on who we are and what we do. You know, dictators come and go. Empires rise and fall. Nations wax and wane. Civilizations live and die. But God reigns forever. He is not only the maker of this universe, he is the ruler of this universe. The Lord is king! Exclamation point. Let the earth rejoice! Exclamation point. Let the farthest coastlands be glad. People don't like it. Some people despise it. Some people want to deny it in our culture. But God is in charge. He is ruling and overruling the affairs of all humanity. You can deny the very existence of God all you want, but it does not dilute the fact that he's in control. And throughout all of human history, he has demonstrated to mankind over and over again how much he is in control. It was Benjamin Franklin who said, "I have lived, sir, a long time. And the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings that except the Lord build, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this, and I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel." What a great quote. What a contradiction to those today who say the founding fathers were not really believers. So you can deny the existence of God, but it does not in any way affect the truth that he is in control. And even 250 years ago, people like Ben Franklin, before all our technology, saw that. Though God does not will every circumstance, he does have a will in every circumstance. That means there are going to be times when things happen that you will not understand. And even in those times, you can be thankful for God's loving leadership. As the first verse we read says, He never stops ruling the earth. Now, two words, I think, capture the very foundation of who God is. They are in verse 2. Dark clouds surround Him. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of His throne. Okay, so in verse 1, He's the ruler of the throne. In verse 2, there are two words that describe how He rules on His throne. He rules with righteousness, and He rules with justice. We never have to defend God because He is always right. It's righteousness. He cannot do wrong. He cannot sin. He is righteous. And righteous is the way God deals with us in our sin. But justice, the second big word, is what God gives to us. Everyone, the wicked and the righteous, will receive justice. There'll be no technicalities, no loopholes. The wicked will experience no leniency, no bribing of the judge, no high-powered lawyer to get them off. Justice will be done. And even when things are at their worst, God is still in control. Our problem is we want everything done when we want it, how we want it. And God's timing is different from ours. A day with the Lord is if 1,000 years. You remember the scripture says? There's so many instances we look back on in life now, and you can probably look back in your personal life, but as I talked about 3 or 4 weeks ago, the fact that people have always tried to destroy the Jews and that Hitler tried to finish off the job, and that was the very thing, and everybody's wondering, where's God, where's God, where's God? Well, that was the very thing that allowed them to create a homeland again. Speaking of that time period in World War II, there's a great book and story about this woman, Corrie ten Boom, who was taken captive by the Nazis and sent to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. And upon arriving, her and her sister Betsy walked into the barrack, and not only did they find the barrack overcrowded and unhealthy, but it was absolutely infested with fleas. That day in their devotional time together, they read instructions in 1 Thessalonians to rejoice always and pray constantly and give thanks in all circumstances. And Corrie said, I'll thank God for some things, but I am not going to thank God for these nasty fleas. And her sister said, God said to be thankful for all things, including the fleas. And so Corrie acquiesced, and they prayed a special prayer about being thankful for the fleas too. During the months at the camp, they openly held Bible studies and prayer meetings in their barrack. And when they did that, the guards never interfered. And they wondered why. And it wasn't until they got out of that prison that they learned that the guards would not enter the barrack because they hated the fleas worse than the women prisoners did. They could indeed thank God for the fleas. The fleas are what kept the guards away. Charles Spurgeon once said, God is too good to be unkind, too wise to be mistaken. And when you cannot trace His hand, you can always trust His heart. And that, my friends, is why we can always be faithful. God is not only magnificent, according to this great text, He is mysterious. He cannot be solved by concentration or calculation or the way we try to solve things today, computerization. Verse 9 says, For you, O Lord, are supreme over all the earth. You are exalted far above all gods. The psalmist is not painting a picture of some far out deity who is remote and removed from the world that he created. He is supreme over all. I get it that there are times when God doesn't seem real just because maybe we don't understand his ways. Have you ever prayed or asked God or sat down in confusion and thought, why God? Why did you do this way? I sure would have done this a different way. We think to ourselves, if I were God, I wouldn't let things happen like that. If I were God, I wouldn't have let things happen that way. That's why verse 2 says, dark clouds surround him. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne. It's hard to see through dark clouds and thick darkness. Even though in one sense we see God in the Bible, we still see him in a dark and limited way. The psalmist is reminding us God is in control, God is sovereign, we're not. We can't see through all the dark clouds that surround him, but we can always be thankful that God is absolutely real and he is absolutely controlling the universe that he created. We can be certain of that. In verses 3 through 6 are very expressive. Fire spreads ahead of him and burns up all his foes. His lightning flashes out across the world. The earth sees and trembles. The mountains melt like wax before the Lord of all the earth. The heavens proclaim his righteousness. Every nation sees his glory. This psalm reminded me of an old story that I used to tell about a new high school teacher in the high school. And you know how high school students will try to intimidate a new teacher and try to get one up on him. So the summer before he was starting to teach for the first time, he suffered a major automobile accident and reported to school the first day with his upper torso, his entire upper torso in a cast. But of course the students couldn't see it. The plaster cast was under the teacher's shirt, and he had covered it over pretty well. And on the first day, the teacher opened the window to let in a breeze from the outside, and the wind was so strong, it started flapping the teacher's tie. And so tie is flapping from here to there. Didn't faze him one bit. He walked to his desk, grabbed the stapler, and tacked his tie to his chest with 4 or 5 staples. And the students are all just sitting out there with their mouth. Wow. Talking about making an impression. Nobody ever was tempted to mess with that guy. Any teacher who staples his tie to his chest, that's a pretty tough guy. And that's the conclusion we should draw from the 4 verses we just read in Psalm 97. You don't mess around with God. You respect him. You reverence him. He is supreme. And not only that, but you put away your stupid idols. Verse 7 says, those who worship idols are disgraced. All who brag about their worthless gods, for every god must bow to him. One of my favorite sermons that I preach, and I often preach it off away from here when I'm not here, is the story of Dagon. And when some of you may remember it, I preached it 3 or 4 years ago on Easter Sunday, when the Philistines captured the Ark of God. They weren't supposed to have it. They shouldn't have had it. The best thing they could have done was have gotten it back to Israel as quick as they could, but they didn't. They wanted to take it kind of captive. And the Philistines captured the Ark of God, and they brought it into the temple of their own God and placed the Ark right beside their fish god, Dagon. So this man-made fish god, as if the true God was paying homage to the Philistine idol. And the next morning, when they went in the temple, they found the idol on his face before the ark. So they set the idol back up, and they left. And the next day when they came in, they found the idol back on the floor, except this time its head was off, its arms were off, and its legs were off. To give them the message, I don't care how many times you set up this false idol, I am sovereign, I can tear him apart. And he did. That's what this means. Those who worship idols are disgraced. All who brag about their worthless gods, for every god must bow to him. No, they wind up embarrassed. For verse 10 says, you will love the Lord, hate evil. He protects the lives of his godly people and rescues them from the power of the wicked. Now, in verse 10, I want to do a couple things here. Here's two things you can take away with you. God will always protect the lives of godly people. Whether you see it or not, you are a child of God, and God has built a fence around you. And the New Testament Christians in the first century believed this, and guess what? So do I. That often there are protective angels watching after you that are a part of that fence. Now, I don't know if you've ever had the experience, but I have once or twice. Once in particular, I was in an automobile situation that there's really less than half of 1% of any kind of a chance that I could have survived a very, very severe accident. And as I sat there in the road, my very first thought was, God protected me through a protective angel. I don't think there's literally any other explanation for this. We're never told in the New Testament that angels would no longer be active. We're told that spiritual gifts would no longer be passed on and be active, but we're never told that about angels. In fact, we're told the opposite. We're told that sometimes we're entertaining angels in the book of Hebrews. We're told that we're entertaining angels unaware. So I think sometimes we are just not aware of how much protection God does give us. Sort of a fence he has built around us. And the only things that penetrate that fence are things that God uses directly or allows for his will in your life. Now listen, that means no luck. No luck. Everything that happens, God either causes or allows for his purposes in your life. For your ultimate good, Romans 8:28 says, and ultimately for his ultimate will. So even when you follow the Lord, you're going to have troubles and trials and tribulations and temptations, just like everybody else, but the hand of God is there to protect you when you are falling. And not only protect you, but guide you, the next verse says. Light shines on the godly, and joy on those whose hearts are right. May all who are godly rejoice in the Lord and praise his name. Now, light in the Bible is always used, and I mean always used, as a metaphor. What is light always used as a metaphor for? God. That's right. 2 or 3 people said it right out. God. Always is. So when you become a believer and a part of his family, God guarantees that if you will live for him and love him and serve him and obey him, you won't walk in darkness. He will guard you and give you light. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light for my path, the psalmist said. So if you follow God long enough, you will discover something. You will be able to look back on your life and see how God ordered your steps. Everybody in this room who's a faithful Christian, who has followed God long enough, I guarantee you can do this. You can look back. I told you a story about this the first night of Vacation Bible School, about how the only way my life could have ended up the way that it did and been arranged the way it did, it would take too much faith to believe it was a coincidence. It would have taken way too much faith to believe it was a coincidence. The only way that it could be believed was that it was a God thing and that God arranged it. And so when you truly believe that, it allows you to trust God fully. That is why the psalmist closes with the words, "Rejoice in the Lord, you who are righteous, and praise his holy name," in verse 12. Now, we're not going to do a deep dive on Psalm 100 because, as I said, we're mostly focusing in this series on the lesser-known Psalms, but it is so important. It's so important particularly to this series of Psalms that are together, which are known as Thanksgiving Psalms, that I didn't want us to just bypass it altogether. So I want us to do with it what we often used to do, you old-timers around here. We would have a Thanksgiving service either on Wednesday night before Thanksgiving or on Sunday night before Thanksgiving. And a part of that was always a congregational reading of Psalm 100, the great Thanksgiving Psalm. So I thought, all right, we're not going to study it, but we are going to emphasize it by reading it. So would everybody read aloud with me Psalm 100 at this time? Shout with joy to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come before him singing with joy. Acknowledge that the Lord is God. He made us and we are his. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving. Go into his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and praise his name. For the Lord is good. His unfailing love continues forever, and his faithfulness continues to each generation. All right, now let's move over into another unknown psalm pretty well, and that is Psalm 102. Where do you think the most remote place in America is? Before I ask that, let me ask you, how many of you have ever been in a really, really remote place? Raise your hand. All right, tell me where it was. Just fire it off. Sinai Peninsula. Montana. Ooh, that might win. That might win, but it only wins till I start to talk. The most remote area is said to be in America, right here, the Thoroughfare Ranger Station in the southeast corner of the Yellowstone National Park. It consists of a cabin, a barn, and a corral. To get to the station, one of the Yellowstone Rangers has to drive about 15 miles from his home, then saddle up his horse and ride 32 miles into the wilderness. And the station is there in the absolute middle of nowhere. Let's get up a trip. Wouldn't you like to just be in a place that remote just for a little while? But truly, truly, the most remote place in the world is the heart of a lonely person. No place lonelier than that. True story. Happened about 4 or 5 years ago. Some of you may remember it in the news. The mummified body of a man named Bill was found sitting just outside Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in a chair in front of his TV in his home. Doctors determined that he had been dead for more than 4 years. Was mummified and had died of natural causes. He was unemployed, 51 years old. No one had reported him missing. He had no relatives. He lived in an attic apartment in an otherwise unoccupied house. And his body was only found when a real estate dealer went to inspect the house for someone who inherited the house. That's one of the saddest things I've ever heard. People from all walks of life experience loneliness. Money can't insure against it. Position cannot rise above it. In fact, some of the loneliest people on earth are people in very high positions. They don't know who to trust. They don't know. They're having somebody taste their food to make sure they're not trying to kill them. Many of these foreign leaders, maybe some of our leaders, I mean, they don't know who to trust. They don't know who to talk to. Some of you know the name Janis Joplin. Janis Joplin, queen of the rock singers in the late 60s, died from an overdose of heroin. And shortly before she died, she said to a friend, "When I'm not on the theater stage, I just lie around, watch television, and feel like I'm the most lonely person in the whole world." The author of Psalm 102 knew what it was like to be lonely. He says in verses 6 and 7, "I am like a pelican of the wilderness. I am like an owl of the desert. I lie awake and I am like a sparrow alone on the housetop." And some of you may be thinking, that's exactly how I feel. I hope not. When I used to do a program here called Bible Hotline. Does anybody here even remember Bible Hotline? There's nobody left. 1, 2 people. We had it in the old building over on McGregor, and I had recorded over 500 messages, and you could call in and listen to messages for 5 to 8 minutes. And the number one listened to message of all the messages, some of them were on doctrine, some of them were on the church, some of them were on personal matters. The number one listened to, we always checked it, and it was every week it was number one, was number 109. You know what number 109 was? Loneliness and what to do about it. That was the single most listened to of all the Bible Hotline messages. And the problem is you can be alone without being lonely. In fact, there are times you may want to be alone. We had Vacation Bible School all week. So, we had Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday night. 330 was our low night. 410 was our high night. Very well attended. Kids running all over the building. Kids everywhere. I'm speaking 4 times, as I said last week. Some of you poor people listen to me speak 4.5 hours in 4 days last week. What are you doing here today? Couldn't you have done something at home in the rain? And so I was lower than a snake, and lo and behold, Diane brings home 3 of the grandkids for us to keep Wednesday night, Thursday, and Friday. And all I wanted was to be alone. Alone. There's nothing wrong with being alone every now and then, but there is something wrong with being lonely. You can be in a crowd of thousands and still feel very lonely. It was Thoreau who said city life is millions of people being lonesome together. And it is. We all want to be noticed by somebody else. We want recognition. Now, loneliness is not isolation in space, it's insulation in spirit. It's feeling as if you're cut off or unnoticed or unloved or uncared for or unneeded, or worse yet, maybe even unnecessary. The silence of loneliness is awful for widows or widowers. It speaks so loudly at night for them when they crawl into an empty bed because their spouse has recently died. It's so awful for recently divorced people for the same reason. Loneliness calls out from an empty mailbox or from a phone that never rings. Loneliness is destructive to our psyches. It's been estimated that 80% of the people who seek psychiatric help do so primarily because of feelings associated with loneliness. And many people become suicidal because they cannot handle the overwhelming feeling of it. In fact, the number one week for suicide all year is the week between Christmas and New Year's. That's when more suicides occur. People feel so lonely, so sad, but they can't seem to do that to themselves or their family right before Christmas, and yet they also can't bear the thought of going into a new year. That's how destructive loneliness is. So if you're going to battle loneliness successfully, you must at least understand why you are lonely. There's no denying the existence of it. It permeates our culture. So the reason often that we feel lonely is, and we have actually added a new acronym to the dictionary, FOMO, F-O-M-O, which means the fear of missing out. It's a new anxiety that everyone is somewhere doing something important or exciting without us. Let me just say, I have zero temptation toward FOMO. But kids do. Young adults do. And loneliness can either be an infrequent state of life or it can be very, very common. Dr. Jeffrey Young of Columbia University describes 3 types of loneliness, in particular that are the top ones. And that is transient loneliness, which is a feeling that comes and goes. Situational loneliness, which only occurs at certain times. Social loneliness, which is a perceived deficit in the quality of social connections. But then here's the one that's the most bothersome. Chronic loneliness, feeling lonely all or most of the time. And you know biblically why that's the most dangerous. Because when God created Adam, and Adam was by himself for a while, he came back and created Eve, and what did he say when he did that? It is not good for man to be alone. Now, some people are lonely because they choose to be alone. We call them loners. There are certain people in life that are that way. Other people are lonely because of their own faults. They're so in love with themselves and so opinionated that other people can't stand to be around them. So with loneliness affecting so many of us in so many parts of society, how do we counter it? How can we become more connected and less alone? Well, Psalm 102 is going to speak to this. It is a messianic psalm. What does that mean? That means it is a prophecy about Jesus Christ himself. Jesus knew what it was to be lonely. In fact, I think he knew loneliness on a level no other person who has ever lived has known. And so this messianic prophecy says, "For my days disappear like smoke and my bones burn like red-hot coals. My heart is sick, withered like grass, and I have lost my appetite. Because of my groaning, I am reduced to skin and bones. I am like an owl in the desert, like a little owl in a far-off wilderness. I lie awake, lonely as a solitary bird on a roof." Remember, it's a psalm about the Messiah. Jesus understands what it's like to be rejected. He can relate to that feeling of nobody cares. John said about Jesus, he came to his own people and even they rejected him. They did. Even his own disciples around him that he had invested 3 years of his life in and that had seen him perform miracles, they deserted him. They ran from him. rejected by his family, rejected by his friends, rejected by the religious elite, ultimately rejected by everybody. Jesus knew what it was like to be lonely. And then at his greatest hour of need, hanging on the cross for some 6 hours, after having been rejected by everybody else I just said, he looked up to the Father and said, my God, why have even you forsaken me? And at that moment, for sure, Jesus Christ became the loneliest person who has ever lived or ever will live, because at that moment, the temple curtain split in half from top to bottom, signifying that the Old Testament would be done away with. It was noon, but all the sky became totally dark. And at that very moment, Jesus was taking on himself the sins of everybody in the whole world. Everybody now, including the Heavenly Father, has rejected him, turned his eyes away from him, and all the sins of the world are on him. No way, nobody could ever be lonelier than that. So he knows what it's like to be alone, and he knows what it's like to be lonely. But Jesus has given us a promise that with God we'll never be alone. As a child of God, we enjoy the permanent company of God for good. Don't love money, be satisfied with what you have. Hebrews 13 says, for God has said, I will never fail you. I will never abandon you. You can enjoy unbroken fellowship with God the Son, who said to his disciples, lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. You can enjoy the continuing presence of the indwelling Holy Spirit of God, with whom we are told he will be with us forever. So, the first cure to overcoming loneliness, feeling like you're an owl in the darkness, feeling like nobody cares, is to turn to the spiritual resources that God has made available to you through himself, his Son, and his Spirit. And here's something else that's an add-on. When you're suffering, when you're lonely, reach out to somebody else who is suffering. And then you'll get two for the price of one plus $1. You'll get a double win. Look for someone else who's lonely and befriend them. Set aside your loneliness and try to be with them in theirs. People everywhere are feeling deeply alone and purposeless. Confusing circumstances everywhere cloud people's vision to their true identity, their fear and loss, and they're not sure who to reach out to. And sometimes they will reach out to anybody who will just listen. Your greatest ministry could lie ahead of you just by you looking around for people who look lost or lonely or needing to have a friend or communicate with. And you be that person that feels that need. And that gets rid of your feelings of loneliness and theirs. That's what Jesus did with us when he dealt with our loneliness. That's what we can do as well.